5. I'm looking for Shelton. Tell him I talked about him tonight. And we did part 2 from Living. For those that were here during a devotional, he was setting everything up and he was asked what was the title of his lesson that he was delivering for the devotional. And he said, Live It. But the interpreter got livid on it. So he turns around and he sees on the screen livid, and it just totally blows everything. Tell him we did part 2 of Livid. We're talking about the power of living tonight, nonetheless. Live it, in other words. From Matthew 5. Now, as Jesus comes onto the scene in a sort of manner, he's been around. 30 years he's been around. His influence has been around. But nothing like what happens at the tail end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. Because now he begins to move among the nations in ways never done before. He starts performing miracles and he works his way from city to city. And he's not a gospel preacher that performs one little private miracle during a sermon. He's going from town to town, healing every sick person that ever is brought to him. It's a massive movement, if you could describe it in that way, of what's happening on these people. And so as he begins and he sees all the multitudes that start following him, we begin with Matthew 5. And he gets up on the mount and he begins to talk to them. And he lays out what's commonly described as the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And on he goes through these different things. And he takes things that we might think were normal things that we don't like to do. Nobody likes to mourn. Nobody wants to have to feel merciful like as if they've been stressed or stretched. But all these things now he looks at from a different perspective as he's describing things that are important for them to understand their spiritual need. A grave problem also existed in that day and time, and that God's leadership of Israel, and that was God's people, were at the bottom of the barrel as far as we could describe as their spirituality was concerned. Now, we can't say just with a broad brush that everybody was horrible, because when we see what's happening, a few of them come to Jesus by night, like in John chapter 3, and a few other people. But for the most part, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, those were God's leaders. They didn't like Jesus, and the big thing was that Jesus lived what he taught, and they didn't. They taught it, but they didn't live it. And so, as he comes to these people in Matthew chapter 5, he's now looking at the multitudes. There were some leaders there representing God's people, and more than probably anything else, curious to what's happening. And he looks at the people, and rather than blaming the Pharisees for their lack of leadership, for their lack of connecting God's word into their lives, he looks at the people and he says, you are the salt of the earth. Didn't point a finger at anybody else. But he talked to the masses. And as he's talking about this, he describes what I would commonly categorize as the power of living. They wanted to see change happening among their people. They wanted to approach God on a different plane other than this showy leadership plane that the Pharisees were doing. So much were the behavior of the Pharisees that eventually the term being a Pharisee by itself represented hypocrisy. They didn't live it. You are the salt of the earth. He's talking about the power that's in living. You can preach a lesson all day long. And for the years that I have been preaching, and for the amount of time that I've ever talked to different people, I have said on occasion and believe wholeheartedly that the best lessons can be done by the way you live, not by what I say. And I'm not that eloquent. Don't ever claim to be. And sometimes people occasionally, they'll say, I like the way you just get it down to everybody's head. And I said, that's where I live. That's all I can do. That's okay. That's all right. But more powerful than that is what you do with your life. Living it has a great power that demonstrates what Paul talks about in Romans 1:16 when he talks about the gospel being the power of God unto salvation. Well, if we are not living it, nobody is going to care to hear about the gospel. It's not going to mean anything to them, because when they look at you, if you're not any different than the rest of the world, they're going to go, that's not important to me. I already live that way. Why do I need what they have? You see. But when we live on a different plane, when we act differently, when we respect people when they don't deserve it, when we love people when they don't deserve it, when we behave like Jesus when most of the world doesn't, when we go to work and we treat people on a different level, it makes a difference. And there's a power in that. And people see it. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, and it had in that day and time, the Christian behavior or the Jewish behavior as the time of Jesus, how are you going to re-salt it, basically, paraphrasing it? I mean, have you ever tried salting salt? If it's no good, just pitch it. You can't salt salt. If it loses the saltiness, get rid of it. You don't add more salt to it, it just can't be done. Might as well throw it away. And that's what Jesus is saying here. And then he talks about the light of the world. You're the light of the world. And a city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden. Well, if you have ever been out at night and you just look up along the ridge here, Christmas time especially, and all these different lights just sparkling and twinkling, beautiful. Can't hide it. And everybody's got all their lights flipped on. Beautiful. Can't be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket. Beautiful Christmas decorations are coming out all over the place, way before Thanksgiving, I know. But nonetheless, they're there. Nobody covers them up. They got spotlights and everything else out there. And if you've seen some of these, just click onto a Google search sometime and just type in Christmas lights and watch what people can do with lights and music and everything else. It's like a show in itself. They don't want to hide it. Let your light so shine, verse 16, before men, that they may see your good works, not praise you, but glorify your Father who's in heaven. Now, here's 4 points to look at. Number 1, the power of your living. Your example, number 1, can be bad. You know, as he talks about being the salt of the earth. And the first thing he says, but if you've lost it, it's not worth anything. Our example can be effectively detrimental to the church if it's not the right kind of example. In Leviticus chapter 10, sons of Aaron, who's the first high priest of God's people, if you ever read through a book of Leviticus, you read the first few chapters, you look at it and go, that's weird. And just visualize what they're doing to set up for this sacrifice. And all the blood that's sprinkled here and poured there, blood on the thumb and blood on the earlobe and blood, and you're looking and going, what on earth? But they were doing it, as you'll read through these chapters, exactly the way God said to do it. And that's what's being pointed out, matter of fact, as you're looking through it. Until you get to chapter 10, and then you find these two characters, Nadab and Abihu. You probably heard those names. Somewhere along the line, those aren't good. Kind of like Jesse James, you know, scoundrel name. Yeah, they did. They did everything right up until the very end, and they got their own fire. Well, fire. I mean, fire's fire, right? Now with God. There was a prescription for it, and they didn't follow it. And God sent down fire on them. Burned them up. And on top of that, here's the point that's being made in chapter 10. As you're looking at it, go back and just jot down a point. Go back and read it. God says, those who approach me must be honoring me or regard me as holy. There was an example they had as God's leaders to respect God, and they didn't do it. And as a demonstration of how not to do it, God said, and he zapped them there. Now, he doesn't keep on doing that. If he did, there'd be a lot of worshipers and a lot of leaders of worship. They'd be zapped. Because not all of that's pleasing to God if you just begin to look at the New Testament. But the power of living on a negative standpoint was enough that God said, you're not going to do that. And you can turn over to the pages of the New Testament. You can look at a character, another couple here, but this one's a husband and wife. This one's Ananias and Sapphira, Acts chapter 5. And they told a big lie. But it wasn't just a lie. They were testing the apostles to see if the apostles could actually tell if they told a lie. And so they brought this money in before the apostles. They said, here's how much we sold our lot for. Kind of like Barnabas back at the end of chapter 4. He got all kinds of praise because he gave it all to the apostles. So they sold their land and they gave half to the apostles, which would have been okay. They said, here's half. But they didn't. They said, we're giving all. We won't be like Barnabas. We like that. Would you give us Barnabas 2 and 3 nicknames? Encourage is what that means? No. And they ended up dying. And what's being demonstrated here as we're looking at this is God says, you got to beware. Jesus, matter of fact, told his apostles, beware of the leaven of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now what he meant by that, those who know anything about cooking, I don't. But I do know that something about that leaven causes bread to grow. And for those of you that have ever gotten involved with Amish friendship bread, it's almost like a curse. Because once you've got it, those I see you nodding, you've had it before. It starts growing, and it grows, and you break them apart, and you put this piece over here, and you add some leaven to it. And the next time you come back, it's about the size of the kitchen. It's just immense, you know. And the first thing we found out way back when is you don't put a Tupperware lid on top of that thing. Because somewhere in the middle of the night while you're sound asleep, it sounds like a cannon just went off in the kitchen downstairs. And it's all over everywhere. But leaven, described like Jesus, is how penetrating it is. Beware of that kind of leaven. It works and you're not paying attention to it. Next thing you know, it's all over the kitchen. Bad influence can tear apart a church or lives. Also, example can be good though. Matthew 5:16. Let your light shine. Just think about that. Some of you, and I'm sure we will we'll just have to just bear with taking our little 2-year-old grandson out and showing him some Christmas lights. Bear with me. We've got to endure this coming up in the holiday season. And we will love it. Because lights are neat. They sparkle. They twinkle. And this is what God's looking for us to be like. Philippians letter talks about that we might shine like stars. Just twinkle out there. Because the world's dark. And the darkness is dark indeed. And God needs good examples. The Old Testament examples, like in Hebrews chapter 11, are laid out there. Those men of faith, and Abraham and Noah, and all these different characters. By faith, they did this and that and all that stuff. And it's a demonstration of how powerful, because hundreds of years later, they're still talking, and we're still talking about those characters. How powerful it is. Paul writes or talks to the people rather in Acts chapter 20. He says, I've done this to give you an example of how to live. And Paul was so concerned about that. So, example can be bad. Example can be good. But either which way, your example can't be hidden. Whatever it is, that's who you are. And they know you. They know you by your example. And here's the point, is as they look at you, they think, Church of Christ. If this is where you go all the time. And they know that's where you go. And so they think good or bad by what you do, what you say, how you act, how you smile, how you treat people. All of that is a reflection of God's people. That being true, and it definitely is, then you want to know, what do I do? How am I acting? Now that character I mentioned a while ago in Acts chapter 4, his name really wasn't Barnabas to start with. It was Joseph. Strange name. Why didn't they call him Joe? But they call him Joseph. We shortened it today. But anyway, here's Joseph. But Joseph, when he does something good, it is so powerful, the apostles give him the nickname Barnabas, encourager. And we have some people like that. We don't call them Barnabas here, but there are encouragers. And I get encouragement from some sometimes. And I hope that you do too, more than I do. But the fact is, we all need that kind of action going on. That kind of influence that's telling people, you can't hide that kind of demonstration. If you are an encourager, it makes a difference in the lives of other people. So be one, and be a good one at it. Can't be hidden. Ananias and Sapphira couldn't be hidden. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, Jesus talked to his apostles. And then there's that common passage, if you'll recall, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul and I believe it was Barnabas show up in this area, and some of the Christians, they go, those people have turned the world upside down are here also. Well, they meant it in a derogatory way. But as Christians, that's exactly what we ought to be doing, because it needs turning upside down. It needs our influence. It needs to see good example. And number 4 is we're looking at this idea of example. Remember I called it living, the importance of living it. The power of it is it makes a difference. Now I'm going to read you a story here that I read years ago. And I attached this little note to a lesson I did back in 2003. The U.S. standard railroad gauge. That's these railroads that run through Chattanooga and all over these other places. The distance between the rails, this railroad gauge as they call it, is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Now you think about that for just a moment. I mean, who got the ruler out there and said, okay, I believe this looks about right. We're going to just do 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Why didn't they do 5 feet? Or 4 feet? Oh, maybe they did the metric system. No, it's still not. It's still not jiving just. But the reason they did that is because that's the way they did it in England. And a lot of the engineers that came over from England to help set up the system used that guide in England. Okay, well that's good. Why did the guys in England do their railroad system that way? Well, it's because the first railroad lines that were built by pre-railroad tramways. And that's the gauge or the distance that they used. Okay, but why do those people use that way back in that time? Well, the wagons, you see, that used to ride over on the long-distance routes in Europe ran at that distance apart. Oh, so you're talking about the 1200s and the 1100s and the dark ages? Yeah, we're talking about way back when the wagons kept going up and down through there. Okay, where did the wagons decide that 4 feet, 8.5 inches was the right size? I mean, what ruler, what crazy thing, did a limb fall out from a tree and they go, well, that looks like a good measurement. Where did they get that? Well, it's because Imperial Rome built their first long-distance roads in Europe, all the way up into England, and their roads have been built that way. The Roman war chariots formed the initial ruts, which everyone else had to match for fear of destroying first the wagon wheels and then after that what came afterwards. So the United States railroad gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches is derived from the original specifications for the Imperial Rome war chariot 2,000 years prior. And this little note says, "And bureaucracies live forever." And so does the power of example. Way back, whenever this guy decided this was the distance to set this up, everybody has been building on that ever since. Our examples can live forever if we'll let them be what they need to be. You ever hear of a name, Benedict Arnold? Sure you have. What did he do? I don't know, but it wasn't a good name. How about George Washington? What did he exactly do? Well, he crossed the Delaware. Great, a lot of people have done that. What else did he do? Something about some weird teeth that he had too, right? Yeah, he had wood false teeth and a few other strange. But he was a patriot. And so we look at those things, and just the name stirs up something. I don't know a child that I've ever met named Jezebel. But I've met thousands of girls named Maria. Because one name means one thing and another means another. The examples of these things live forever. Now here's the rest of this. When you see a space shuttle sitting on a launch pad, there are two big booster rockets. Now this was written in 2003, mind you. I think it might have changed some since then. Booster rockets attached to the sides of the main fuel tank. These are solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. The SRBs are made by a company, a factory in Utah. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. The engineers that are there designing the SRBs would have preferred to have made them a bit fatter, but the SRBs had to be shipped by train. And to get from the factory to the launch site, they came by train. You can't fly those boogers, they're too big. The railroad line from the factory happens to run through a tunnel in the mountains from Utah. The SRBs had to fit through that tunnel. The tunnel is slightly wider than the railroad track. And the railroad track, as you know, is 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. So our major space shuttles today are engineered around war chariots of Rome built 2,000 years ago. The impact of example. Living it makes a bigger difference than preaching it. Believe me, let your light shine, and let it shine good. This holiday time, let it shine. Post your New Year's resolutions and aim them towards shining bright and reminding yourselves of what you can be in this powerful world as Christians. How are you living tonight? Adjustments? Maybe so. Been baptized? I don't know. It's important you bet your life. Matter of fact, your soul. Unless you're born of the water and Spirit, Jesus says you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Not my rules. But I believe in the one who said it. Are you a Christian? And are you living it? And if either one of those is no, let's adjust it to that standard that was built way back before this system we've been talking about. Solid rock, firm as can be, and live it. If you need to come, come and stand safe.